There is a specific kind of arrogance required to believe that a few ounces of beige pigment and industrial-strength setting powder can deceive a man who reads human micro-expressions better than he reads the morning financial reports. Yet there I was, standing beneath the crystal cascades of the vain charity gala's oversized chandeliers, praying to a god I hadn't believed in since childhood that the shadows were forgiving enough to save my life. The ballroom was a suffocating sea of velvet tuxedos and diamond-encrusted necklines, a chaotic symphony of clinking champagne flutes and hollow laughter that usually allowed me to disappear into the background as the decorative, silent wife of the city's most dangerous predator. But tonight the air felt thinner, sharper, as if the oxygen were being siphoned out of the room by the sheer gravity of the man standing beside me. Caspian Vane did not merely occupy space. He consumed it, radiating a cold, dark heat that kept the other guests at a respectful, terrified distance while his hand rested on the small of my back, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, possessive code against the silk of my emerald gown that felt less like affection and more like a ownership claim stamped in bone and blood. I had spent 45 minutes in front of the vanity mirror in the master suite before we left, layering concealer over the throbbing, angry discoloration on my jawline with the precision of a restoration artist working on a damaged Renaissance masterpiece, terrified that even a single breath of air might crack the facade and reveal the violet-black bruise blooming underneath. It was a souvenir from a job I should never have taken, a desperate, violent skirmish in an alleyway 3 hours ago that had ended with a dead blackmailer's associate and the hilt of a combat knife slamming into my face with enough force to rattle my molars, a secret violence that was supposed to remain buried in the dark, far away from the pristine, bloodless world Caspian insisted I inhabit. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a hummingbird trapped in a cage of bone, as I took a delicate sip of champagne, trying to steady the tremor in my hand because Caspian noticed everything, the way I breathed, the way I blinked, the way my pulse jumped in the hollow of my throat. And if he looked too closely tonight, he would see the ghost of a killer staring back at him from beneath the layers of a trophy wife. "You're quiet tonight, Alara," he murmured, his voice a low baritone rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and straight up my spine, causing the fine hairs on my arms to stand on end as he turned his body toward me, effectively walling me off from the rest of the party with the broad expanse of his shoulders. I forced a smile that felt tight and brittle, like old parchment about to snap, and tilted my head just slightly to the left, keeping the bruised side in the shadow cast by his silhouette, hoping that the dim, atmospheric lighting he preferred would mask the slight swelling that the makeup couldn't quite flatten. "I'm just tired, Caspian," I lied, the words tasting like ash on my tongue, because lying to him was like trying to smuggle a lit flare through a gunpowder factory, dangerous and almost certainly doomed to explode in my face. But I pushed the excuse forward anyway, weaving a narrative of a headache and the overwhelming noise of the orchestra. He didn't answer immediately, which was always his way, letting the silence stretch and twist until it became a physical weight, forcing the other person to fill the void with truths they didn't want to speak. But I remained silent, clutching my glass until my knuckles turned white, watching his eyes, those terrifying, beautiful irises the color of frozen whiskey, scan my face with the detached intensity of a surgeon deciding where to make the first incision. Then he moved. It wasn't a violent motion, nor was it sudden enough to draw the attention of the senator's wife standing 10 feet away. But to me, it felt like the strike of a viper, as his hand slid from my waist, traveled up the column of my neck, and cupped my jaw with a grip that was agonizingly firm. I tried to pull back, a purely instinctual flinch born of the throbbing pain that flared beneath his fingertips, but his fingers tightened, anchoring me in place as he leaned in closer, invading my personal space until the scent of him, sandalwood, expensive scotch, and the metallic tang of imminent violence, filled my lungs and drowned out the perfume of the crowd. "Stay still," he commanded, the order whispered against my ear with a deceptive softness that terrified me more than a shout ever could. And before I could conjure another lie or pull away, His thumb brushed against the sensitive skin of my jawline. He didn't just touch me. He rubbed, hard, a deliberate and ruthless friction that dragged across the carefully applied layers of foundation and concealer. I felt the makeup give way, the illusion dissolving under the rough pad of his callus, and panic, cold and absolute, flooded my veins as he pulled his hand back to inspect the smudge of beige pigment staining his skin. The transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous and terrifyingly subtle. The polite, bored mask of the socialite billionaire vanished, replaced by the predator who ruled the city's underworld with iron and fire, his eyes darkening until the iris was indistinguishable from the pupil, two abysses threatening to swallow me whole. He looked from his thumb to my face, where the angry purple mark was now exposed in the unforgiving light of the ballroom, a gruesome contrast to the elegance of the evening, and the temperature between us seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single heartbeat. "That's a new scar," he said, his voice dropping to a register that was barely human, a growl that scraped against my nerves like a rusted blade, and the way he said it implied ownership, as if my skin were a map, and he had memorized every inch of the territory, immediately recognizing an unauthorized alteration. "You thought paint could hide it from me?" "Caspian, please, not here," I whispered, glancing around frantically to see if anyone had noticed the shift in our dynamic. But the world had narrowed down to just him, and the accusation burning in his gaze. "Who touched you?" he demanded, ignoring my plea, his hand returning to my face. But this time his grip was possessive, his thumb tracing the outline of the bruise with a terrifying tenderness that promised retribution for whoever had put it there. "Tell me, Alara, so I know who to flay first. Because if you tell me you fell, or walked into a door, or any of those pathetic lies women tell to protect the men who hurt them, I will burn this entire building to the ground with everyone inside just to make sure I get the right one." I hit the vanity, I stammered, the lie sounding weak and pathetic even to my own ears, crumbling under the weight of his stare like dry leaves under a boot. He laughed then, a dry, humorless sound that sent a shiver of dread coursing through my blood. And without another word, he gripped my elbow, his fingers digging into the sensitive nerve endings with enough pressure to bruise, and began to march me toward the exit. It wasn't a request. It was an abduction in plain sight, executed with such supreme confidence that the crowd parted for us like the Red Sea, mistaking his ruthless handling for protective urgency, or perhaps a lover's quarrel that they were too polite to interrupt. We moved through the gilded double doors and into the cool night air, leaving the music and the safety of the public eye behind, and as the valet scrambled to bring the armored black SUV around, I realized that I had walked out of the frying pan and straight into the inferno. The drive back to the penthouse was a study in psychological torture. The silence inside the hermetically sealed cabin, so thick it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of Caspian's breathing, which was slow, controlled, and utterly lethal. He didn't look at me, keeping his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead, but his hand rested on the center console, a fist clenched so tight the knuckles were white, radiating a tension that filled the small space with electricity. I stared out the tinted window at the blurring city lights, my mind racing through a catalog of worst-case scenarios, wondering if he knew about the file, if he knew about Silas Thorne, if he knew that his delicate, fragile wife had snapped a man's neck 3 hours ago and was currently carrying a microblade tucked into her garter belt. When the car finally slid into the private underground garage of the Vane Tower, the steel gate clanging shut behind us, with the finality of a prison cell door, Caspian killed the engine but didn't unlock the doors, plunging us into a darkness illuminated only by the harsh fluorescent security lights overhead. He turned to me then, the shadows cutting across his face to make him look like a vengeful god carved from marble, and reached into the glove compartment to retrieve a packet of antiseptic wet wipes, the sound of the plastic tearing echoing loudly in the stillness. "Look at me," he ordered, and I obeyed, turning my head slowly to face him, my heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy, terrified of what he would see in my eyes. He didn't scream. He didn't hit. He simply reached out and began to scrub the rest of the makeup from my jaw, his movements methodical and relentless, erasing the last of my defenses until the full extent of the injury was laid bare. A nasty, contused laceration where the metal hilt had split the skin and crushed the capillaries beneath. The wipe came away stained brown and red, and he tossed it onto the dashboard with a sneer of disgust, before grabbing my chin again, tilting my face to the side to inspect the wound with a clinical, terrifying expertise that reminded me he was a man who had inflicted thousands of such injuries himself. Lies insult us both, Ilara, and I have tolerated your little secrets, because I thought they were harmless, because I thought you were just playing at having a private life, he said, his voice devoid of emotion, which was infinitely worse than anger, because it meant he was thinking, calculating, putting pieces of a puzzle together that I had spent years trying to keep separate. But this is not a domestic accident. You didn't trip, and you didn't hit a piece of furniture. He traced the edge of the bruise with his index finger, pressing just hard enough to make me wince, his eyes locking onto mine with a hypnotic intensity that stripped me bare. This is the impact mark of a combat knife hilt, a specific tactical strike used to disorient an opponent in close-quarters combat, he murmured, analyzing the violence written on my skin, as if he were reading a report from one of his lieutenants. And as the words left his mouth, the air left my lungs because he knew. He recognized the technique, the signature of the violence, and there was no way a socialite who spent her days at charity luncheons should have a mark like that. So tell me, Tesoro, who are you fighting in the shadows while I am busy ruling the light, and why does it look like you barely survived? I opened my mouth to speak, to deny, to fabricate some elaborate story about a mugging I was too ashamed to report, but the look in his eyes stopped me cold. It was a look of profound, terrifying betrayal, mixed with a dark, obsessive hunger that told me he wasn't just asking for a name. He was asking for my soul. He leaned across the console, his hand sliding from my jaw to wrap around the back of my neck, pulling me forward until our foreheads were touching, and I could feel the heat radiating off him, burning through the icy dread that had settled in my stomach. You are keeping dangerous company, little bird, he whispered against my lips, his breath hot and laced with the scent of mint and fury. And you have forgotten that you belong to me. Every inch of skin, every drop of blood, every scar is mine to protect and mine to ruin, so if someone else has dared to mark what is mine, I need to know, because the war you are fighting is no longer yours alone. He didn't wait for an answer, didn't give me a chance to confess or to run. He simply unlocked the doors and got out, coming around to my side to haul me out of the car and into his arms, carrying me toward the elevator like a wounded soldier, or perhaps a prisoner of war. As the metal doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing us in together, I realized that the makeup had hidden more than just a bruise. It had hidden the reality of our marriage, and now that the mask was gone, I was left alone with a monster who loved me, and I wasn't sure if that was my salvation or my death sentence. The elevator ascended smoothly, counting the floors toward the penthouse, and with every passing number, I knew that the interrogation was far from over. In fact, as Caspian watched the numbers climb with a muscle feathering in his clenched jaw, I knew that once we crossed the threshold of our home, the real dismantling of my secrets would begin, and I had no idea if I would survive the night intact. The silence of the penthouse was not the tranquil quiet of a sanctuary, but rather the heavy, pressurized stillness of a vault just before the oxygen runs out. And as the steel-reinforced doors of the private elevator slid shut behind us, with a resonant metallic thud that echoed like a prison sentence, I realized that the man standing beside me was no longer the husband who brought me peonies on Tuesdays, but the ruthless capo who had dismantled rival syndicates with the same detached precision he was currently using to unbutton his tuxedo jacket. Caspian moved through the sprawling, dimly lit living space with a predatory grace that made the exorbitant Italian furniture and priceless modern art look like fragile obstacles in the path of a natural disaster. His silence far more terrifying than any shout could have been, because it was a contained, pressurized silence that promised an explosion of catastrophic proportions if the wrong wire were tripped. I stood by the entrance, my heels sinking into the plush velvet of the rug, shivering not from the climate-controlled air, but from the sheer force of his presence as he walked to the wall-mounted security panel and punched in a code that I knew, from years of watching him, initiated a total lockdown of the floor. The electronic beep of the system engaging was the sound of my world shrinking down to these four walls, a gilded cage suspended 50 stories above the city, where I had bled for secrets that were now unraveling in the harsh light of his suspicion, and when he finally turned to face me. The darkness in his eyes had swallowed the whiskey gold flecks entirely, leaving behind a void that threatened to consume me whole. He didn't speak immediately, simply staring at me across the expanse of the room with a look that dissected my soul, peeling back layers of carefully constructed lies until I felt naked despite the emerald silk still clinging to my body. And then he pointed a single, commanding finger toward the master bathroom, a gesture so authoritative that my feet moved before my brain could process the indignity of being ordered around like a subordinate. I walked past him, the air between us crackling with static electricity and the scent of his pheromones, a heady mix of musk and danger that made my knees weak even as my survival instinct screamed at me to run. But there was nowhere to run to, not when the windows were bulletproof glass, and the only exit was guarded by the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard. The master bathroom was a cavernous space of black marble and gold fixtures, usually a place of relaxation where we would share steam showers and lazy Sunday mornings. But tonight, the harsh vanity lights reflected off the polished surfaces with an interrogation room glare that highlighted the smear of blood on my jaw and the pallor of my skin. Caspian followed me in, closing the door with a click that sounded deafening in the tiled acoustic space, and without a word, he gripped my waist and lifted me effortlessly onto the cold marble counter, his hands large and warm and terrifyingly gentle, as he positioned me between his spread thighs like a doll he was afraid of breaking, but determined to inspect. He turned away for a moment to rummage through the medicine cabinet, the clinking of glass bottles and the rustle of sterile packaging, setting my nerves on edge, and I took the opportunity to study his back, the broad expanse of muscle shifting under the fine linen of his dress shirt, wondering how I could possibly explain a combat knife wound without revealing that his docile, socialite wife was actually the retired assassin known in the underworld only as the Wraith. When he turned back, holding a bottle of antiseptic and a stack of gauze, his expression was a mask of constrained fury, a terrifying calmness that barely concealed the violence churning beneath the surface, and he stepped into my personal space until his thighs brushed against my knees, trapping me against the mirror that reflected our distorted, tragic tableau. "Tilt your head back," he murmured, the command falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse, and as I obeyed, exposing the vulnerable column of my throat to him, he poured the stinging liquid onto a cotton pad and pressed it against the laceration on my jaw with a firmness that made me hiss in pain, a sound that seemed to ripple through him, causing his jaw muscle to feather as he fought the urge to hurt whoever had done this to me. The sting was sharp and biting, a chemical fire that cauterized the wound and cleared the fog in my head, but it was nothing compared to the burn of his gaze as he worked, his eyes tracing the jagged line of the cut, the blossoming bruise surrounding it, and the faint, older scars on my neck that I usually kept hidden under high collars or clever makeup. "This was not an amateur," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against my chest as he dabbed away the dried blood. His movements possessed of a terrifying competence that reminded me he had stitched up his own bullet wounds more times than he cared to admit. "The angle of the impact suggests an upward strike, intended to disarm or incapacitate, and you took the hit. But you didn't go down, Did you, Ilara? I stayed silent, biting the inside of my cheek to keep the truth from spilling out, because admitting that I had blocked the follow-up strike and shattered the attacker's wrist would only confirm his suspicions that I was not the woman he thought he married. But the silence only seemed to fuel his obsession, his thumb brushing over the pulse point in my neck, which was fluttering like a trapped bird. He tossed the bloody cotton into the bin and picked up a tube of healing salve, applying it with a tenderness that was at odds with the violence of his words, his fingers lingering on my skin as if he were trying to absorb the memory of the trauma through osmosis, to take the pain from me and transmute it into rage he could unleash upon the world. You are a terrible liar, my love, because your body betrays you even when your mouth is shut, he whispered, leaning in until his forehead rested against mine, his eyes boring into me from inches away. Your pulse is racing, your pupils are dilated, and your muscles are coiled tight, ready to spring, ready to fight, which begs the question, why is my wife reacting like a soldier in a war zone instead of a victim? Before I could answer, his hands moved from my face to the zipper at the back of my gown, the sound of the metal teeth parting echoing like a tearing of flesh in the quiet room, and panic flared in my chest because the bruise on my face was not the only mark I had brought home from the alleyway tonight. I tried to catch his wrists, to stop him, but he was relentless, peeling the silk bodice down with a determination that brooked no argument, and as the fabric pooled around my waist, the cool air hit my skin, followed immediately by the heat of his gaze falling upon the dark, mottled bruise blooming across my left rib cage, a souvenir from a steel-toed boot that had connected when I was momentarily distracted. The air left the room instantly, sucked into the vacuum of Caspian's sudden, absolute stillness, and for a terrifying second he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. He just stared at the violent purple mark marring the creamy skin of my torso, a mark that screamed of brutality and close-quarters combat. Then the explosion came, not with a shout, but with a sudden violent motion as he gripped my hips and pulled me forward, burying his face in the crook of my neck while his hands spanned my ribs, his fingers splayed wide as if to shield the injury from the rest of the world, his breath coming in ragged, harsh gasps against my skin. "Who?" he growled, the word vibrating through my bones, and this time there was no sophisticated veneer, no Mafia Don composure, just the raw, primal sound of a male who had found his mate wounded and was ready to tear the throat out of anything that moved. "I will not ask you again, Ilara. Give me a name. Give me a location. Give me anything, or I will tear this city apart brick by brick until I find the person who dared to put their hands on you." "I can't," I whispered, the words trembling as they left my lips, because telling him meant revealing Silas Thorne, and revealing Thorne meant revealing the blackmail, the files, the list of hits I had carried out against the Vane family's enemies and their allies before I had ever met Caspian. He pulled back, his hands sliding up to cut my face, holding me so tightly I thought my skull might crack, his eyes wild and desperate and furious. "You think you are protecting someone? You think your silence is noble? You are protecting a corpse, Ilara, because whoever did this is already dead. They just don't know it yet. And by keeping this from me, you are only delaying the inevitable and forcing me to become something I promised I would never be with you." The pain in his voice cut deeper than the knife had, a raw vulnerability that I had never seen in him before. And I realized with a sinking heart that he thought I was protecting a lover, or perhaps just terrified of him, when in reality I was terrified for him. Terrified that the darkness in my past would swallow the light we had built together. He ran his hands down my arms, checking for more injuries, his touch frantic and consuming, needing to map every inch of pain so he could claim it, own it, and avenge it. And I let him, sitting pliable and exposed on the cold marble, wishing I could just dissolve into the ether and escape the impossible choice pressing down on me. "I'm not protecting anyone," I said, trying to inject some strength into my voice, trying to channel the wraith instead of the wife. "I handled it, Caspian. It's done, it's over, and you don't need to burn the world down for a scrap I've already won." He froze, his hands gripping my upper arms, and looked at me with a mixture of awe and horror, processing the implication that I had fought back, that I had handled a situation that left me looking like a battered wife, and a dark, twisted pride flickered in his eyes before being subsumed by the overwhelming need for control. "You handled it?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky whisper that slid over my skin like a caress. "You think walking into my home bleeding and bruised constitutes handling it? No, Tesoro. Handling it means the other person doesn't walk away. Handling it means you don't come home with new scars. And since you are sitting here bleeding on my counter, I am going to assume that you failed to finish the job properly, which means I have to finish it for you." He stepped back abruptly, the loss of his body heat leaving me shivering, and began to pace the small confines of the bathroom, running a hand through his hair, his mind clearly racing through tactical scenarios, list of enemies, and potential leads, treating my body like a crime scene he had to solve. I watched him, my heart aching with a toxic mix of love and fear, because I knew that look. It was the look he wore before he ordered a hit, the look of a man who had switched off his humanity to do what needed to be done, and I was the cause of it. "Stay here," he commanded suddenly, turning on his heel and marching toward the door, his energy shifting from frantic concern to cold, calculated purpose. "Do not leave this room, do not unlock the door, and do not make a single phone call, because if I find out you have tipped off whoever did this, I will not be responsible for what happens next." "Where are you going?" I called out, sliding off the counter, clutching the ruined bodice of my dress to my chest, panic rising in my throat because if he started digging, if he started pulling threads, the whole tapestry of my lies would unravel within the hour. "I am going to my study to access the citywide surveillance grid," he said without looking back, his hand on the doorknob, his knuckles white. "I will trace the car, I will trace your phone, and I will find where you were tonight, Ilara. And once I have a location, I will send a cleanup crew to find whatever remains of your handled situation and extract the truth from them, piece by piece." The door slammed shut before I could protest, the lock clicking into place from the outside, leaving me trapped in the sterile brightness of the bathroom, with nothing but my reflection and the terrifying realization that he was going to the one place I couldn't allow him to go. My heart stopped, then restarted with a frantic, painful thud against my bruised ribs, because Caspian's study wasn't just where he kept his surveillance equipment. It was where I had planted the bug 2 years ago, and more importantly, it was where I had hidden the encrypted drive, the one containing the blackmail material, inside the false bottom of his humidor, waiting for a chance to destroy it. If he was tearing the study apart looking for clues about my attacker, he wouldn't just find the surveillance footage of me entering the alleyway. He would find the drive, and once he cracked the encryption, which would take him less than an hour given his resources, he wouldn't just see a list of my victims. He would see his own brother's name on a contract I had accepted and then aborted 5 years ago. I stared at the locked door, the adrenaline flooding my system, washing away the pain and the fatigue, replacing it with the cold, sharp clarity of the assassin I used to be, knowing that I had perhaps 10 minutes before he started tearing through the physical evidence in his office. I wasn't just fighting for my marriage anymore. I was fighting for my life. And the only way to survive was to get out of this bathroom, bypass the lockdown, and get to that humidor before Caspian Vane discovered that the woman he was trying to avenge was actually the greatest threat he had ever allowed into his home. The realization hit me like a physical blow, galvanizing my muscles as I looked around the room for a tool, a weapon, anything to pick the lock. Because the countdown had started, and if I didn't get to the file first, the new scar on my jaw would be the least of my problems when the truth came out. The lock on the bathroom door was a high-end, tumbling pin mechanism that would have baffled a common thief or a desperate house guest. But to a woman who had spent the better part of a decade sliding through the ventilation shafts of maximum security compounds and bypassing biometric scanners with nothing more than a strip of celluloid and a prayer, it was an insultingly simple barrier that yielded to the tension of a modified nail file, and a bobby pin I had salvaged from my ruined updo with a satisfying, almost apologetic click. I eased the door open just a fraction of an inch, holding my breath until my lungs burned, listening for the heavy tread of Caspian's footsteps on the hardwood, or the low murmur of his voice speaking into a secure line. But the penthouse was wrapped in a silence so profound and absolute that it felt less like an absence of sound, and more like a predator holding its breath before the final, fatal lunge. My heart was hammering a frantic, syncopated rhythm against my bruised ribs, a physical reminder of the violence I had barely survived earlier that evening. Yet the pain was distant and muted now, pushed to the background by the icy flood of adrenaline that sharpened my vision and turned the familiar, luxurious hallway of my marital home into a tactical grid of shadows and kill zones. I slipped out of the bathroom, leaving my heels behind on the cold tile, my bare feet making no sound on the plush Persian runner as I moved toward the west wing where Caspian's study was located, knowing that every second I wasted was a second closer to him, discovering the encrypted drive hidden in the false bottom of his humidor, the drive that contained the digitized soul of the Wraith, the dossier of every hit I had ever executed, including the aborted contract on his own brother, that would turn his possessive love into a vendetta that would end with a bullet in my brain. The corridor seemed to stretch out endlessly before me, the eyes of the portraits on the walls following my progress with judgmental stares. And as I passed the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the rain-swept city below, I felt a sudden, vertigo-inducing dissociation, as if the woman reflecting in the glass, disheveled, bruised, moving with the lethal grace of a hunting cat, was a stranger invading the life of Alara Vane, the pampered socialite who was supposed to be weeping in her bathroom. Caspian had said he was going to access the surveillance grid, which meant he would be sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, his back to the door, focused on the monitors that lined the far wall, and my plan, reckless and desperate as it was, relied entirely on the hope that his rage had blinded him to the immediate threat inside the room, allowing me just enough time to slip in, retrieve the drive from the cigar box on the sidebar, and vanish back into the shadows before he noticed the theft. I reached the heavy oak double doors of the study, my hand hovering over the brass handle, trembling slightly not from fear of death, but from the terrifying realization that if I opened this door and he saw me, I would lose him, not to a bullet, but to the hate that would replace the warmth in his whiskey-colored eyes when he realized his wife was a monster who had once accepted money to destroy his bloodline. I turned the handle with agonizing slowness, the mechanism well-oiled and silent, and pushed the door open just enough to slip my body through the gap, stepping into the lion's den with the scent of old leather, expensive tobacco, and gun oil filling my nostrils, a sensory profile that was unmistakably Caspian. The room was bathed in the blue glow of computer screens and the warm, amber light of a single desk lamp, but to my confusion, the high-backed leather chair behind the desk was empty, swiveled slightly to the side as if its occupant had just risen, and the silence in the room was heavy, expectant, charged with a static energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't waste time questioning his absence, moving quickly across the room toward the sidebar where the crystal decanters and the humidor sat, my eyes darting to the corners of the room, scanning for movement, for the flash of a weapon, for the shadow of a man who moved like smoke. I reached the humidor, my fingers fumbling with the latch in my haste, and flipped the lid open, ignoring the rich aroma of Cuban tobacco that wafted up as I dug my fingernails into the seam of the velvet lining to pry up the false bottom, expecting to feel the cool, sleek metal of the flash drive that held my life in its digital grasp. My heart plummeted into my stomach, a sensation of freefall that was more nauseating than any physical blow, because the false bottom was already pried open, the velvet torn askew, and the small, hollow space underneath was empty, void of the one thing that could destroy me, meaning that someone had already found it, someone had already taken it, and there was only one person in this penthouse who had the access and the suspicion to search this specific box. A sound from the other side of the room, the distinct, terrifying sound of a heavy file folder hitting the surface of a desk, caused me to spin around, my hand instinctively going to the hidden sheath in my garter where my microblade was stored, my body dropping into a defensive crouch before my mind could catch up to the reality of the situation. Caspian was leaning against the far wall, deep in the shadows of the bookshelves, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the intricate tattoos on his forearms, watching me with an expression that was unreadable, detached, and utterly terrifying in its calmness, as if he were watching a play he had already read the script for and was simply waiting for the actors to hit their marks. "Looking for this?" he asked, his voice soft and devoid of the rage I had expected, gesturing with a tilt of his chin toward the desk where a thick manila folder lay open, the glow of the lamp illuminating the top page, which bore a grainy, zoomed-in photograph of me from 5 years ago, standing on a rooftop in Prague with a sniper rifle slung over my shoulder, my face partially obscured by a tactical mask, but my eyes, my distinctive, mismatched eyes, clearly visible. The air left my lungs in a rush, my knees threatening to buckle under the weight of the revelation, because the folder wasn't just the drive. It was a comprehensive dossier, a detailed forensic accounting of my past that was far more extensive than anything I had hidden in the humidor, implying that he hadn't just found my secret tonight. He had known about it for a long time, perhaps even before he put the ring on my finger. I straightened slowly, my hand falling away from my weapon, because there was no point in fighting a man who already had his finger on the trigger of a nuclear weapon, and I looked at him, waiting for the shouting, for the violence, for the accusation that I was a traitor, a liar, a snake in his bed. "How long?" I whispered, the question hanging in the air between us like a ghost, my voice sounding small and fragile in the cavernous room, stripping away the last remnants of the confident assassin, and leaving only the terrified wife who loved him more than she loved her own survival. 6 weeks before the wedding, he replied, pushing himself off the wall and walking slowly toward the desk, his eyes never leaving mine, tracking my micro-expressions with the intensity of a hawk circling a field mouse. "My head of security brought me a discrepancy in your background check, a gap in your employment history that didn't align with your story about art school in Paris. And I dug deeper, because I am a paranoid man, Alara, and because when something seems too perfect, like you, it usually hides a rot underneath." He stopped behind the desk, his fingertips resting on the open file, tapping lightly on the photograph of me holding the rifle, a rhythmic sound that echoed the ticking of a clock counting down to my execution. I found the records, the transfers to offshore accounts, the surveillance footage from the Interpol database that Thorne had been leaking, and I saw the contract on my brother, the one you accepted and then abandoned 3 days later without explanation. "I didn't take the shot," I said quickly, the defense spilling out of me before I could stop it, desperate for him to understand that even then, even before I knew him, some instinct had stopped me from pulling the trigger on his blood. I sent the advance back. I walked away. "I know," he said, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Not anger, but a strange, dark satisfaction that confused me more than his silence. "If you had taken the shot, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You would be buried in the foundation of the new casino, and I would be drinking alone." He rounded the desk, closing the distance between us until he was standing just inches away, invading my personal space with his heat and his scent, forcing me to tilt my head back to look him in the eye. And I saw that the darkness in his gaze wasn't hatred. It was a profound, terrifying acceptance, a recognition of the monster in me that mirrored the monster in him. "I was waiting for you to tell me," he murmured, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his fingers brushing against the tender skin of my cheek, sending a shiver down my spine that was equal parts fear and arousal. "I gave you the perfect life, the perfect cover. I let you play the role of the innocent wife because I thought that was what you wanted. To leave the blood behind and live in the light. And I was willing to protect that delusion for you because seeing you happy was the only thing that quieted the noise in my head. But then you came home bleeding, he continued, his voice hardening, the tenderness evaporating as his thumb traced the line of the bruise on my jaw again, pressing down with a possessiveness that made my knees weak. You came home with a mark that belongs to a world I thought you had escaped, and I realized that my silence was a mistake. Because while I was playing house, someone from your past was dragging you back into the mud, and you didn't trust me enough to ask for help. I was protecting you, I insisted, tears stinging my eyes, angry tears born of frustration and relief and the overwhelming intensity of his proximity. Thorn threatened to release the file to your enemies? He said he would destroy your reputation, your alliances, if I didn't do one last job for him, and I couldn't let him take everything you built because of my past sins. Caspian let out a short, harsh laugh, shaking his head as if I were a naive child who didn't understand the rules of the game. My reputation? My alliances? Do you think I care about the opinions of sheep, Alara? Do you think I wouldn't burn every alliance I have to the ground to keep you safe? He grabbed my hand, the one that had held the gun, the one that had killed men, and brought it to his lips, kissing the knuckles, kissing the calluses that I had tried so hard to buff away with expensive creams, acknowledging the violence in my hands and worshipping it. You are not a liability to Sorrow. You are the deadliest weapon in my arsenal, and I have been keeping you sheathed, letting you rust, when I should have been sharpening you. He pulled me closer, wrapping an arm around my waist, his grip bruising and desperate, as if he were trying to merge our bodies into one entity. And I realized with a jolt of shock that he wasn't disgusted by my past. He was aroused by it, validated by it, because it meant that I wasn't the fragile glass doll he had to protect, but a partner who could stand beside him in the fire. Thorn is the one who gave you this scar, he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that was deadlier than a scream, his eyes focusing on the wound on my jaw with a singular, murderous intent. Yes, I breathed, the truth finally out, the weight of the secret lifting off my shoulders and leaving me lightheaded. He has a warehouse on the docks. He's waiting for confirmation of the hit. Then we will give it to him, Caspian said, turning me toward the door, his hand resting on the small of my back, guiding me not toward safety, but toward the violence I had tried to escape. And I realized that the cage door hadn't just been opened, it had been ripped off its hinges. Go upstairs and change, Alara. Put on something black, something that allows you to move, because tonight you are not Mrs. Vane, the charity organizer. He paused, looking back at the file on the desk, then at me, a dark smile playing on his lips that promised carnage and retribution on a biblical scale. Tonight, you are the Wraith, and we are going to remind Silas Thorne why people used to whisper your name in the dark. But first, you are going to show me exactly how you got that scar, and then I am going to show you exactly what happens to men who touch what belongs to me. As I walked out of the study and toward the stairs, my heart pounding with a fierce, wild rhythm, I realized that the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity and a burning need for vengeance that matched his own. I wasn't running from the monster anymore, I was running with him, and God help anyone who stood in our way. The transformation from the pristine, emerald-draped socialite to the lethal specter known as the Wraith was a ritual I had performed 1,000 times in the dark corners of safe houses and motel rooms, but performing it now, in the sprawling master closet of the Vane penthouse under the watchful, heavy gaze of my husband, felt less like a tactical necessity, and more like a religious unveiling, a stripping away of the final layers of pretense to reveal the steel and rot beneath. I discarded the ruined silk gown on the floor, stepping out of it with a careless disregard that I never would have dared show an hour ago. And, as I pulled on the black tactical cargo pants and the form-fitting thermal shirt that would offer some protection against the damp night air, I could feel Caspian's eyes tracking every movement, his gaze feeling like a physical touch that burned hotter than the brand of any iron. He didn't offer to help me this time, understanding that this was a metamorphosis I needed to complete alone, but he stood leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his chest, his tuxedo jacket discarded, and his own shoulder holster strapped over his white dress shirt, looking like a fallen angel contemplating a war against heaven. I sat on the velvet ottoman to lace up my combat boots, the familiar weight of the steel-toed leather grounding me in a way the delicate stiletto heels never could, and as I tightened the laces with a sharp, practiced tug, I realized that for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't dressing to impress him or to reflect his status, but to stand beside him as an equal in the only arena that truly mattered to men like us. We moved to the armory, a hidden room behind the wine cellar that I was never supposed to know about, though I had picked the lock 3 months after moving in, just to inventory the stock, and the air inside was cool and smelled of gun oil and cold metal, a scent that calmed my racing heart more effectively than any sedative. Caspian watched in silence as I bypassed the standard Glocks and reached for a customized Sig Sauer P226, checking the slide and loading the magazine with a fluidity that betrayed years of muscle memory, the metallic clack-clack of the chambering round echoing loudly in the confined space. He didn't ask if I knew how to use it, nor did he offer me a smaller, easier weapon, a silent vote of confidence that thrilled me more than any diamond necklace he had ever draped around my neck, because it meant he finally saw me, not as the fragile thing he had to cage, but as the predator he had unknowingly married. He selected his own weapons, a pair of heavy-caliber handguns, and a combat knife with a serrated edge that looked wicked enough to gut a man in seconds, and when he turned to me, handing me a suppressor with a dark, knowing smirk, the electricity arcing between us shifted from the tension of secrets to the volatile, explosive chemistry of shared violence. Thorne has 12 men guarding the perimeter and another 5 inside the warehouse, according to the thermal scans I just pulled from the satellite feed, he said, his voice calm and conversational, as if we were discussing the seating chart for a dinner party rather than a massacre. And he moved toward me to adjust the strap of my shoulder holster, his knuckles grazing the swell of my breast, sending a jolt of heat straight to my core. He thinks he is safe because he believes you are terrified, isolated, and desperate to protect your secret. But he has made the fatal error of forgetting that a cornered animal is dangerous, and he has certainly forgotten that you are now hunting with the wolf pack. We took the elevator down to the garage, bypassing the luxury sedans and the chauffeured limousines in favor of a matte black armored interceptor that looked like it had been bred for war rather than the highway, the heavy doors closing with a reassuring thud that sealed us into our own private capsule of impending doom. Caspian drove with one hand on the wheel, his other hand resting heavily on my thigh, his thumb drawing slow, distracting circles on the tactical fabric of my pants, a constant reminder of his claim on me even as we sped through the rain-slicked streets toward the industrial district where the city's rot was allowed to fester. The city lights blurred past us in streaks of neon and gold, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to the carnage we were about to unleash, and I found myself staring at his profile, at the sharp line of his jaw and the ruthless set of his mouth, wondering how I had ever thought I could hide my true nature from a man who was cut from the exact same cloth of darkness and ambition. "He touched you," Caspian murmured, breaking the silence that had settled over the car, his voice low and laced with a cold, terrifying promise that made the temperature in the vehicle seem to drop. "He put his hands on you. He bruised you. He made you bleed. And for that alone, simply killing him will not be enough to satisfy the debt he owes me." "I want to be the one to end it," I replied, the words leaving my mouth before I could filter them, a declaration of intent that felt necessary to reclaim the agency I had lost when Thorne had blackmailed me, when he had forced me back into the shadows I had tried to escape. "He used my past against me. He tried to turn me into a weapon against you, and I need him to know, in that final second before the lights go out, that he didn't break me. Caspian glanced at me then, his eyes dark pools of unholy admiration, and he squeezed my thigh hard enough to leave a mark. A gesture of approval and possession that told me he understood the bloodlust because it flowed in his veins just as thickly as it did in mine. You will have him, Ilara. But everything leading up to him, every guard, every obstacle, every breath of air in that warehouse, that belongs to us, a joint venture in destruction. The GPS led us deep into the shipyard, a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and towering cranes that loomed like skeletal giants in the mist, until the sprawling, corrugated iron structure of Thorne's warehouse came into view, bathed in the harsh yellow glow of security floodlights. Caspian killed the headlights and let the car coast to a silent stop in the shadow of a stacked container, the engine ticking as it cooled, the sound swallowed by the rhythmic crashing of the dark water against the pier. We sat there for a moment, suspended in the quiet before the storm, the tension in the car so thick it was almost suffocating, a potent mixture of adrenaline, fear, and a twisted, darkened desire that made me want to kiss him as badly as I wanted to fight alongside him. "Remember," he whispered, turning to face me, his hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the new scar on my jaw with a reverence that felt like a benediction. "Tonight, there is no mercy. There is no hesitation, and there is no hiding. Tonight, you show them exactly why I chose you, and you show them that the Vane family does not bleed without drowning the world in return." I nodded, the cold steel of the gun in my hand feeling like an extension of my own arm, and as I opened the car door and stepped out into the damp, salt-laced air, the wind whipping strands of hair across my face, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace settle over me. The wife was gone, left behind in the penthouse with the silk dresses and the lies. All that remained was the Wraith and her king, and as we moved in perfect synchronization toward the perimeter fence, merging with the shadows like ghosts returning to haunt the living, I knew that before the sun rose, the concrete floor of that warehouse would be painted in red, and my new scar would be the last thing Silas Thorne ever saw. The warehouse was a cavernous cathedral of rust and shadows, echoing with the chaotic symphony of gunfire that we had unleashed upon crossing the threshold, and as we moved through the corrugated maze of shipping containers, not as two separate entities, but as a singular, lethal organism, I felt the last vestiges of Ilara Vane, the trembling socialite, incinerate in the heat of the muzzle flash. We breached the inner sanctum where Silas Thorne had entrenched himself, moving with a synchronized fluidity that felt almost telepathic, Caspian covering my blind spots with the ruthless efficiency of a machine while I cleared the catwalks, the recoil of the Sig Sauer jarring my arm in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, a violent affirmation that I was finally, terrifyingly alive. The men Thorne had hired were professionals, mercenaries bought with blood money, yet they crumbled before us like paper dolls in a gale because they were fighting for a paycheck while we were fighting for something far more primal. A twisted, blackened sort of love that demanded a sacrificial offering to sanctify its existence. I vaulted over a stack of pallets, my boots skidding on the concrete floor slick with oil and the debris of the firefight, and leveled my weapon at the last guard standing between me and the office door, putting 2 rounds into his center mass before he could even raise his rifle. The sound of his body hitting the floor, lost in the ringing silence that suddenly descended upon the room. The silence was heavy, pregnant with the smell of cordite and copper, and through the haze of smoke, I saw Caspian standing amidst the carnage he had wrought, his white shirt splattered with crimson abstract art, his chest heaving not from exertion, but from the sheer intoxicating rush of the violence we had shared. He looked at me across the expanse of the slaughterhouse, his eyes burning with a dark, proud fire that seared straight through to my soul, and with a single nod, he holstered his weapon and gestured toward the metal door where the architect of my nightmare was cowering, granting me the right of way to claim the vengeance I had been denied for so long. I kicked the office door open, the lock shattering under the force of my boot, and found Silas Thorne scrambled into the corner behind his desk, clutching a pistol with shaking hands that betrayed the sudden, crushing realization that his leverage had evaporated the moment the devil and his wraith walked through the door. He looked from me to Caspian, who loomed in the doorway like a grim reaper in a tuxedo, and I saw the color drain from his face as he realized that the fragile woman he thought he could break was standing over him with the cold, dead eyes of the assassin he had foolishly tried to blackmail. You told him?" Thorne stammered, the gun wavering in his grip as he tried to comprehend the shift in the power dynamic, unable to process that his meticulously crafted cage had been torn apart by the very beasts he tried to trap. "You were supposed to be scared. You were supposed to be ashamed of what you are." "I was," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of the fear that had plagued me for weeks, stepping closer until the barrel of my gun was inches from his forehead, forcing him to look at the bruise he had left on my jaw, the purple mark that was no longer a badge of shame but a declaration of war. "I was terrified that he wouldn't love the monster Silas. But you made a critical error in judgment. You forgot that monsters don't fear the dark. They rule it. And by forcing me to reveal myself, you didn't destroy my marriage. You weaponized it." I didn't shoot him then. Instead, I fired a single round into his kneecap, a calculated strike that sent him screaming to the floor in a heap of agony, the sound of his pain filling the small room and mingling with the hum of the overhead lights. Before I could decide how to end him, Caspian was there, moving with that terrifying speed, kicking the gun out of Thorne's hand and pinning him to the floor with a heavy boot to his chest, looking down at the groaning man with an expression of utter contempt. But Caspian didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he reached into his belt and pulled out his own combat knife, the serrated steel glinting in the harsh light. And then, in a gesture that was more intimate than any kiss we had ever shared, he held the handle out to me. "Trace it," Caspian commanded, his voice a low, rough growl that vibrated through the floorboards, pointing not to the weeping man on the floor, but to the scar on my own face, and then gesturing to Thorne's throat with a grim finality. "He carved his name into your history, Ilara, so now you will carve him out of your future, and you will do it with my blade so that he knows, in his final second, that he died because he touched what belongs to the Vane family." I took the knife, the handle warm from his skin, and the weight of it felt like a transfer of power, an acceptance of my duality that bound me to Caspian more irrevocably than our wedding vows ever could. I knelt beside Thorne, ignoring his pleas for mercy, which were as hollow as his threats had been. And I did exactly what my husband asked, ending the threat with a single, precise motion that severed the tie to my past and washed away the fear in a tide of red. When I stood up, breathing hard, the adrenaline crashing into a wave of exhaustion and euphoria, Caspian didn't flinch from the blood on my hands. He reached out and pulled me into his arms, burying his face in my hair, inhaling the scent of violence and victory that clung to my skin. We left the warehouse as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, leaving the cleanup to the crew that was already en route, and walked back to the armored car in a silence that was no longer heavy with secrets, but buoyant with a newfound, terrifying freedom. Inside the car, the safety of the dark leather cocoon enveloping us, the tension that had sustained us finally broke, shattering into a desperate, hungry need that had us reaching for each other before the engine even turned over. Caspian pulled me into his lap, not caring about the blood on my clothes or the grime on my skin, and tipped my head back to look at me in the growing light, his thumb tracing the fading outline of the bruise on my jaw with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "No more makeup," he whispered against my lips, his voice raw and wrecked with emotion, a command that was also a plea, a promise and a vow all rolled into one. "Let them see the bruise, let them see the scars, let them see every mark that life has left on you, because every single one of them is proof that you survived the fire and came out tempered steel." He kissed me then, a searing, possessive kiss that tasted of iron and salt and forever. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, illuminating the city that we owned, I realized that the scar on my face wasn't a flaw to be hidden, but a line in the sand that separated the girl I used to be from the queen I had become. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful thud of his heart, and smiled into the darkness of his coat, knowing that while the world might see a beauty and a beast in the shadows where it mattered, we were just two monsters who had finally found the only other creature in the dark capable of loving us back. 3 months had dissolved into the ether since the night the warehouse burned, washing away the blood and the ash, but leaving behind a quiet, unbreakable understanding that had reshaped the very architecture of our marriage, transforming the penthouse from a cage of secrets into a fortress of shared dominion where the silence was no longer heavy with things unsaid, but comfortable with the weight of mutual, lethal respect. We were standing once again in the foyer of a grand ballroom, this time for the winter solstice gala, a sea of diamonds and treacherous smiles that mirrored the opening scene of our story. Yet the woman reflecting in the gilded mirrors was a stranger to the terrified creature who had frantically plastered concealer over her bruises just 90 days ago. I wore black tonight, a gown of crushed velvet that swallowed the light rather than reflecting it, cut dangerously low in the back to expose the faint, silvery ridge of old scars that mapped the violent geography of my past, and my face was bare of anything but a touch of mascara and a blood-red lip, leaving the faint, thin white line on my jaw, the souvenir from Silas Thorne's final mistake, exposed to the world as a warning rather than a flaw. Caspian stood behind me, his reflection towering over mine in the glass, his hands resting heavy and hot on my hips, his thumbs brushing against the silk of my dress with a possessive rhythm that told everyone watching exactly who I belonged to. Not as a possession to be hoarded, but as a queen to be worshipped. He leaned down, the rough stubble of his jaw grazing the sensitive skin of my neck, and whispered something that made the heat pool in my belly. A reminder that the gun strapped to my thigh beneath the velvet was not just for show, but a functional accessory that he had personally cleaned and loaded for me earlier that evening. The fear that used to strangle me in these crowds, the terrifying anxiety that someone would recognize the wraith beneath the socialite's skin, had evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, sharp amusement because I knew that if anyone dared to cross the line tonight, they wouldn't just be dealing with the vain syndicate's enforcers, but with the woman standing at the head of the table. "They are staring at you," Caspian murmured against my ear, his voice vibrating with a dark, predatory pride as he watched the room pretending not to watch us, his eyes scanning the crowd with the relaxed alertness of a lion who knows he has no natural predators in the savannah. They used to look at you and see a delicate flower they could crush if they squeezed hard enough, but now they look at that scar on your jaw and they see the thorn that will bleed them dry, and I have never seen anything more beautiful in my life. We moved into the ballroom, not merging with the crowd this time, but parting it, the whispers trailing in our wake like the turbulence behind a jet engine, and I held my head high, meeting the gaze of a rival capo's wife, who had once made a snide comment about my lack of pedigree. She looked at the scar, then at the cold emptiness in my eyes, and quickly looked away, sensing with a primal instinct that the rules of engagement had shifted irrevocably. I realized then that Caspian was right. The makeup had been a shield for my own insecurities, a way to cling to a normalcy I had never truly possessed, but stripping it away had forced the world to acknowledge the steel spine that held me upright. Later in the evening, we found ourselves on the balcony overlooking the frozen city, the noise of the party muffled by the heavy glass doors, standing in the same biting cold that had welcomed us the night we became partners in blood. Caspian handed me a glass of whiskey, neat, just the way he drank it. And as I took the glass, his fingers lingered on mine, tracing the knuckles that were still slightly bruised from a sparring session we had shared in the gym that morning. A new ritual of foreplay that involved sweat and grappling and the intoxicating friction of skin against skin. "Do you miss it?" he asked softly, looking out at the skyline that glittered like a spilled jewelry box, referring not to the killing, which we both knew was a necessity of our world, but to the anonymity, the safety of being the invisible woman who existed only in the shadows. "I missed being seen," I replied, turning to lean against the stone railing, letting the wind bite at my exposed skin, because it made me feel alive, looking at the man who had torn down my walls only to build a castle around me. "I spent my whole life being a ghost, Caspian, hiding from my enemies, hiding from the law, and eventually hiding from you. But you dragged me into the light and forced me to look at myself, and I realized that I don't want to be invisible anymore. I want to be the nightmare they see coming." He stepped closer, closing the small distance between us, and reached out to touch the scar on my jaw one last time, his touch a benediction that sealed the jagged edges of my soul. "You are not a nightmare, Ilara. You are the reality check they all desperately need, the proof that a king is nothing without a queen who knows how to hold a sword." He kissed me then, under the cold, indifferent stars, a kiss that tasted of whiskey and triumph, and as I melted into him, feeling the solid beat of his heart against my own, I knew that the story of the fragile girl was over, written in disappearing ink and washed away by the rain. In its place was a saga written in blood and gold, a testament to the fact that broken things don't always need to be fixed. Sometimes they just need to be sharpened, honed, and loved by someone brave enough to hold the blade without flinching. The makeup was gone. The secrets were buried in a grave alongside Silas Thorne, and as I looked at the city sprawling beneath us, I smiled a sharp, dangerous smile, knowing that for the first time in my life, the face I showed the world was exactly the one I wanted them to fear.